You're listening to Pixelated Audio episode 101, and today we're covering the music of Manabu Saito. Welcome back to the video game music and retro gaming podcast, Pixelated Audio. I'm your host, Gene. The track that brought us in today was the FM version of the opening from the game Euphory for the Sharp X1. Today is the first in a new series that I'm introducing about the music of deceased composers. It's kind of an experiment, and I'll be tweaking the formula as time goes on, but for today I'll be doing the show solo. We talked about the show concept at the end of episode 99 as one of the ways we were going to introduce new content. The focus will be less about a specific game and more of a historical perspective on the composer and their music. The idea for this episode came to me after my appearance on episode 91. We'd talked about Manabu Saito then, but I didn't know that much going into the episode. I really enjoyed the music from Yuurei-kun and was really sad to find out that he had died so young, so I started digging more into his history. And it took me down this long rabbit hole of looking at his music and the music of other deceased composers. There were some names I knew, some I didn't, some I was surprised to see, but I wanted to start with Manabu Saito first since he was the one that got me on this journey in the first place. As a longtime fan of the show and periodic guest, I was honored when the team at Pixelated Audio brought me on board as a permanent member and were willing to let me try the show out as a new concept. Although I'm leading this specific show solo, this is a collaborative effort between all of us at Pixelated Audio, and we hope you enjoy it. Over the course of the episode, I'll be covering the majority of Manabu Saito's music at System Sacom in approximately release order, from his first game Euphory to his last game Jerry Boy. It's an ambitious episode, but I want to cover things with the right level of depth. Moving into some background about Manabu Saito, he was born in 1970 in Niza City, Saitama Prefecture. He grew up playing piano from elementary school, and in high school he learned how to program his own compositions. At one point, he applied for and won a computer composition contest and got first prize, earning himself a Roland piano. He was a huge fan of the classical masters like Bach and Mozart, and he even journals about the summer he spent studying music in Vienna during high school. There, he refined his piano skills and learned more advanced composition techniques. Around 1987, at the age of about 16, Saito joined System Sacom as a part-time composer, but shortly after became their main in-house composer for the next several years. To honor Manabu Saito's love of classical music, I'm going to be breaking the games into three separate periods, the early, middle, and late periods, each group containing 5 games and lasting approximately 1 year. The early period covers games between October of 1987 to November of 1988. The games in the middle period were released between March and June of 1989, a very aggressive period of releases. And the late period covers games between October of 1989 and September of 1991, with most being completed before the end of 1990. To get back into a little bit of music, and to contrast with the opening, the next piece is also from Euphory, but this time from the PSG version of the soundtrack. So here is Vertes, or Berutesu, from Euphory. That was the PSG version of Vertes from Euphory, composed by Manabu Saito. We begin the early period with Manabu Saito's first game, Euphory for the Sharp X1. Released in October of 1987, Euphory is a medieval-themed side-scrolling action RPG in the vein of Wonder Boy and Monsterland or other side-scrolling action games. The game follows the brother and sister pair Raphael and Falrum on a journey to save their mother after she falls gravely ill. They must travel to her homeland to find the rare medicine to cure her. Typical of the genre, the game consists of town areas where the player can buy weapons and equipment, and combat areas, some of which require swimming or basic platforming. There's no experience point system. Instead, defeated enemies award the player gold and healing items. You can play as either of the two characters or in a two-player co-op mode. The music for Euphory was composed for both the Sharp X1's onboard PSG and OPM expansion chips. It's a fairly strong first soundtrack full of lots of short and simple tunes. In a lot of Saito's early games, the song structure and chord progressions have a much more classical influence, but you'll start to see hints of his unique style as time goes on. The sound design is pretty basic, but keep in mind he was probably only 16 when he wrote it. The second game from Saito's early period is Fire Rock on the Famicom disk system. Fire Rock only has about 4 full tracks on the soundtrack, and what's there is just alright, but for only being a second game and on new hardware, it's not a bad attempt. The track that I'm going to play is probably the best of the bunch, and it does have a few neat tricks with channel echo, and I really enjoy that last section before the loop. So let's listen to the second track in the game, which I'll call track 2, from Fire Rock on the Famicom disk system. That was track 2 from Fire Rock on the Famicom disk system. Fire Rock is an action game developed by System Sacom and published in Japan by Use, with the design of the game credited to Mark Flint. In the game, the player controls a caveman-like character whose goal is to navigate a series of caverns in an effort to locate the boss and defeat it, and then get to the door to the next level. Fire Rock's only one of a few original console game soundtracks that Saito wrote, with the rest being mostly on Japanese home computers. From what I can tell from videos and internet responses, Fire Rock isn't a well-loved or well-remembered game. Strangely, I found it referenced more often on English-language sites than on Japanese ones, despite being a fairly obscure Famicom disk system game. I even had to watch a video of the end credits just to make sure that the game was actually made by System Sacom and composed by Manabu Saito. The third game in the list is one of their novelware games. And before I get on to talk about the game, I should probably explain a little bit about what that is. Although they produced a wide range of games, System Sacom was best known for their novelware series. Heavy on text and light on choices, they were a series of visual novels that often combined serious themes, cinematic elements, and fitting music as part of the narrative. While they weren't the first visual novels, they were fairly early and quite influential to the genre, especially in terms of presentation. There were a total of 7 novelware games produced, all of which had music composed by Manabu Saito. This third game, and the first of the novelware series, is called Dome, or The Dome, released in June of 1988. The track that I'm going to play is also titled The Dome from the X68000 version of the game. It's a slightly modified version of the opening, with the only real difference being slightly different instrument patches. So here is the X68K version of The Dome. That was The Dome from the X68K version of Dome, composed by Manabu Saito. The story of Dome can be described as a modern-day Noah's Ark. In order to protect against the threat of nuclear destruction, you play as a character helping to construct a dome to save humanity. The story reflects the Cold War paranoia of the time, and it carries through in the fittingly moody music. The opening of the game begins with a shot of a cityscape, followed by a fade to white implying a nuclear blast. Then an image of a destroyed city that slowly pans over to the schematic of the eponymous dome, and finally the music begins. I can imagine how impactful that would have been in 1988, and even now it still carries a bit of weight. Dome was released on a number of platforms, including the X68000, the X1, the PC-88 and 98, and the MSX2. In practice, that means there are 3 versions of the soundtrack, the PC-88 version using the OPN, the X68K version using the 8-channel OPM, and the FM7 version which uses a combination of PSG and OPN. Manabu Saito was credited as the lead composer, but he's sometimes credited with Kuniku Sakurai and Koichi Sato. I dug into the manual and Sakurai was listed as effects and sound programming, while Sato was a supervisor. Koichi Sato did write music for Sacom's earlier March and Veil series, so it makes sense he would supervise a young Saito on his first game in a new series. Like many visual novels, the music in Dome plays at key moments. What's a little bit less common and somewhat interesting is that the music in Dome doesn't loop. Tracks have a defined ending. What that means is that some of the time, Dome is spent in silence. Saito didn't do this for any of his previous games or any of his later games. I've seen a few claims about why that decision was made, but nothing really conclusive. In any case, it was an intentional choice. Dome is Saito's first really substantial work, and I love the mood of a lot of the tracks. There's some improvement in the use of FM sound patches, as well as some fairly lengthy pieces of music compared to Euphory. The 4th game in the early period, we have Soft and Hard Stories, released in July of 1988. This is technically the 3rd Novelware game, but due to scheduling changes, it was released second. I really enjoy this next track. It's a bit goofy, but here is the RPG theme from Soft and Hard Stories on the OPM chip for the X68000. That was the OPM version of the RPG theme from Soft and Hard Stories. Most of the Novelware games are fairly serious, but Soft and Hard Stories and its sequel are much more lighthearted with the music to match. The game is a tongue-in-cheek visual novel where you play as the son of a software company manager, and you have to take over when your father becomes ill. Using your company's strengths and your own imagination, you produce Dame, a clear reference to Sacom's previous Novelware game, Dome. The soundtrack is made up mostly of classical-inspired tunes, or in many cases direct arrangements of well-known tunes, such as Saber Dance by Aram Khachaturian. Soft and Hard Stories released on the X68K, the PC-98, and the FM Towns. The main versions of the soundtrack were released for the OPM, OPN, and OPNA chips, as well as a few CD-only tracks on the FM Towns version. Manabu Saito's sound design has definitely improved compared to earlier games, but given how silly the game can be, I find this one a little bit hard to come back to. I can imagine this track shows up at a point where you're either developing or playtesting a JRPG. The entire premise of the game is a fairly meta-narrative, so the regal and pompous nature of the track is probably intentional, making fun of the medieval RPGs like Dragon Quest that were coming out at the time. The 5th and final game in the early period is Chatty, which released only on the PC-88 in November of 1988. While technically the second Novelware game, it was released after Soft and Hard Stories, as previously mentioned. Chatty's music on the PC-88 was written for both the OPN and OPNA chips. I'll be playing the track Bar from the more robust OPNA chip. It's got a smooth, bossa nova groove and some mellow sounds despite being quite up-tempo. So here is Bar from Chatty for the PC-88. That was the OPNA version of Bar from Chatty on the PC-88. The plot of Chatty is based on a story written by science fiction writer Sanpei Kamada. Chatty is set in the future and involves a man who is framed for a crime he didn't commit. In an attempt to clear his name, the protagonist discovers a device that allows for interdimensional travel, and he ventures into a parallel dimension in search of answers. I like the Bar theme, and to me it sells the future noir setting which was popular in the late 80s and early 90s. You can hear Saito's definitely developing his own style here. This soundtrack, as well as a few others like Providence, Euphory, and Yuurei-kun, are already up on VGM rips right now, so give those ones a listen. In the spirit of honesty, the music from the early games isn't amazing, but I have to remind myself that at this point he was only about 18 years old and had already written the music for about 5 games just about a year. Certainly better than anything I was doing at that time. So even if the tracks in Chatty don't fully develop on all of their musical ideas, there's a foundation for really solid tracks that are starting to come together in just the next few games. But before I move on to that next period of games, I wanted to quickly mention a few of my sources of information. At Pixelated Audio, we strive to have as much accurate information as possible. Luckily, a lot of Manabu Saito's music contributions were well documented for the time, typically using his full name in the credits, which made it easier to cross-reference on a lot of sites and verify this information. For cross-referencing games, descriptions, and credits, I used VGMDB, or Video Game Music Database, VGMPF, or Video Game Music Preservation Foundation, GDRI, or Game Developer Research Institute, Moby Games, the Japanese wikis for Manabu Saito and System Sacom and their games, as well as a few fan sites and Japanese articles about specific games. For music comparisons, I listened to what was available on our sister site VGM Rips, as well as Hoot Rips hosted on Zophar's domain and the invaluable Egg Music, which re-released almost all of Saito's music for purchase around 10 years ago. Egg Music gets extra kudos for providing a lot of interesting commentary about the music and a nearly exhaustive collection of sound sources for the different games. Brian was also kind enough to rip a lot of the tracks for the episode which weren't easily available through other sources. Lastly, an invaluable resource was the memorial site for Manabu Saito, hosted for many years by his brother Akira. In addition to being a memorial site, it was a place to store Manabu's various writings, documents, and drawings that he made over the years, as well as a place for Akira to blog about his experiences and collect some of the emails he'd received about Manabu over the years. It's a very touching website, and it's still available via the Wayback Machine, and I'll leave a link to it in the show notes. With the end of 1988 and Manabu Saito's early period, we enter the whirlwind middle period. These 5 games were released between March and June of 1989. There's a bit of similarity in some of the sound patches, some direct callbacks to current and previous games. That shouldn't be too surprising since he was either composing them all at the same time or one right after another. While Saito's classical influences are still quite apparent, there's a much heavier exploration of contemporary pop, rock, dance, jazz, and other genres. For the first game in the middle period, we have Evolution on the FM Towns, released in March of 1989. There are only about 8 tracks in the game, but the one that stood out to me the most was from Stage 1. It starts with fairly dark piano clustered chords, and opens into a more hopeful but still melancholy track. So here's Stage 1 from Evolution on the FM Towns. That was Stage 1 from Evolution on the FM Towns. The music in Evolution has a very dense texture, with lots of pads, orchestra and percussion samples, and lots of fast-moving melodic parts. If I had to characterize Manabu Saito's music in general, it's moody, a little bit sad, with heavy use of melody to produce that effect. The game Evolution is a simple first-person perspective 3D shooter set in an abstract environment that features a full CD audio soundtrack. The protagonist is an evolving creature who must survive an onslaught of other organisms. You move forward automatically and control the movement up, down, and to the sides. The only real gameplay objective is to shoot enemies and increase your score. To be honest, Evolution is more of a tech demo than it is a full game, but it's an interesting one nonetheless. And definitely a departure from the action RPGs and visual novels that System Sacom normally made. Music is a big jump in fidelity with the use of CD audio. A lot of the musical ideas from this game come back in later games, especially the way the percussion's used. Now before we get too far along, I think this is a good time to talk about Saito's company, System Sacom. Founded in 1981 in Sumiya Ward of Tokyo, System Sacom was originally created to sell computer hardware and peripherals. Their first game, Valiant, was released in 1983 for the PC-98 and was credited to Mark Flint, the same developer as Fire Rock and many of their earliest games. There's no doubt he had a big influence on the company's decision to develop and publish games. From what Brian and I were able to find, Mark Flint was a native Texan that made a name for himself as a developer in Japan in the early 80s, working at System Sacom and a few other companies, and later on developing for the Sony PlayStation. In an interview he gave to a Japanese blog in the mid-2000s, he discussed the importance of staying adaptable. He was also fascinated by the potential that the Wii and other novel interfaces were providing at the time. I couldn't find that much more about him, but like Nasir Gabelli at Square, he definitely contributed a lot to early 80s Japanese video games as a programmer. Now, most of System Sacom's early games were for Japanese computers, but as time went on they branched out into consoles like the Mega Drive or Genesis, the Famicom, Saturn, 3DO, and PlayStation. A few of their games did make it out west though, including Jennifer Capriati's Tennis, also known as Grand Slam the Tennis Tournament for the Genesis or Mega Drive, Jerry Boy, known here as Smart Ball for the Super Nintendo, Yumemi Mystery Mansion for the Sega CD, Seal of the Pharaoh for the 3DO. For the Saturn, we have Lunacy, also known as Toriko, as well as the Mansion of Hidden Souls. They also co-developed Deep Fear with Sega for the Saturn in Europe and Japan, which turned out to be one of the last European Saturn games. They also did a bit of 3D animation for Blue Stinger on the Dreamcast before withdrawing from the game industry in 1998. Now going back to the second game in the middle period, we have Providence, a top-down action RPG in the style of Ys, released in April of 1989 for the PC-88. The next track is short but sweet. I really love the way the melody lingers on dissonant notes in the A section before moving on to the more open B section. So here is the OPNA version of Dungeon 7, or Cave of Plateau, from Providence. That was the OPNA version of Cave of Plateau from Providence on the PC-88. The story of Providence goes as follows. An island is inhabited by 4 countries living in peace together. From out of nowhere, a blue orb shoots down to Earth, landing on the island. The orb remains solitary for many years, but as time progresses, its powers grow. Several years pass, and the powers of the orb continue to grow. However, one day, a woman discovers it and decides to take the orb. She tries to use it to take over the world, but instead becomes corrupted by its power and turns into a demon. Soon after, the power of the orb spreads to the rest of the island, causing it to be overrun with monsters. Your typical action RPG plot of the time, no doubt. Like other Saito soundtracks around this time, the music was written for both the OPN and OPNA chips. I really love the soundtrack to Providence, and it feels like a turning point in his music. A lot of the ideas developed in Chatty and other games really start to take shape. Even the shorter tunes feel more fully realized. Egg Music states that Manabu Saito was most likely influenced by the music of similar games at the time, like those produced by Falcom, and The Scheme written by Yuzo Koshiro. It certainly feels that way, and a lot of these tracks would feel right at home in an Ys or a Phantasy Star game, that's for sure. The third game in the middle period is Yuurei-kun, Manabu Saito's only MSX2 score released in April of 1989. You can thank Yuurei-kun for providing the inspiration for this episode. I do still really love this soundtrack, and the music is very memorable despite how simple the PSG chip can be. Here is the music from Stage 2, also called Hellhole from Yuurei-kun on the MSX2. That was Hellhole from Yuurei-kun on the MSX2. The story of Yuurei-kun, or Mr. Ghost, is about a ghost that has no memory of how he came to be. He sets out on a strange journey to meet the great king Enma in the underworld to learn who he is and where he came from. In the game, you control Mr. Ghost, or Yuurei-kun. He can float around, bash enemies, fire a limited number of bullets, as well as gain several Gradius-style wisps that can follow along your path and fight with you. If you're interested in learning more about the game and the music, I definitely recommend you listen to episode 91. We go through pretty much the entire soundtrack and it's well worth a listen. I also wanted to take this time to mention a quick piece of trivia before moving on to the next game. There's a number that occasionally gets thrown around. It's said that Manabu Saito wrote over 2,000 songs at System Sacom before his death. Now, as ridiculous as that sounds, I'm sort of inclined to believe it. With around 15 games, many with 2 or 3 sound sources, and about 20 tracks apiece, just that's already about 500 tracks composed or arranged. And these are just the tracks that saw a full release. Now moving back to the 4th game in the middle period, we have Valna, another action RPG released in May of 1989, and Saito's last composition for the PC-88. The track I'm playing is the OPNA version of Grassland, another upbeat rock track, similar in style to the music in Providence. That was Grassland from the OPNA version of Valna for the PC-88. In Valna, a monster named Badu was sealed 250 years ago and is suddenly released again. You play as the descendant of the god that sealed him. Valna takes place in mostly top-down action scenes similar to those in the first couple of Ys games, and even some slightly side-scrolling sections sort of like Ys 3 or Zelda 2. I wasn't able to find too much about this game, but let's be honest, it's a fairly conventional action RPG of the day. As for the music, like other PC-88 games, it has an OPN and OPNA version of the soundtrack. Stylistically, there's a lot of similarities between Valna and Providence. They use similar sounding patches, and they both feature the same kind of fast-paced rock sound typical of the action RPGs of the late 80s. 2 action RPGs released a few months apart? Sure, why not reuse a few sounds? The last game in the middle period is Soft and Hard Stories 2, released in June of 1988 for the PC-98 and X68000. This is the 4th Novelware game and a direct sequel to the first game. It follows the adventures of the protagonist after his father returns to run a software company after being sick in the last game. Like the first game, Soft and Hard Stories 2 also features a lot of simpler tunes based on classical compositions, this time with things in it like Swan Lake. It was really hard for me to find a good track to pick from this soundtrack because they're either overly simple or obnoxiously over the top. I can certainly imagine the music fitting into the game, but like the first one, it's probably not a soundtrack you're going to want to listen to all that much out of context, beyond a few tracks. The track I'll be playing is one of the more over-the-top ones. It's a cover of Thaxted from the Jupiter movement of Gustav Holst's The Planets, written in 1921. The music was set to the poem I Vow to Thee, My Country, which was originally written in either 1908 or 1912 by Cecil Spring Rice. The poem describes how a Christian owes his loyalties to both his homeland and to the heavenly kingdom. The hymn has become quite popular in England, including the funerals of Winston Churchill, Princess Diana, and Margaret Thatcher. I recently watched a lot of this British comedy show called The Windsors, and the melody shows up almost any time a character makes a self-righteous speech, which seems fitting, actually. Thankfully, I'm only going to play one loop of this track to spare you because the percussion is just so ridiculous. So here is Driving Before Dawn from the OPM version of Soft and Hard Stories 2 on the X68000. That was the OPM version of Driving Before Dawn from Soft and Hard Stories 2. I haven't talked all that much about the Novelware games themselves. Visually, they look a little bit like The Uninvited and Deja Vu and other games by Mac Venture. Gameplay-wise, they're fairly simplistic visual novels, which are much more dense on story than gameplay. In fact, for many of the games, as soon as you boot them up, the story just starts. No start game or anything. The earliest Novelware games feature primitive graphics using low-res digitized images or drawings, often in grayscale or a very simple color palette depending on the hardware. The main portions of the game take place in a series of small windows. Almost everything gets its own box: the character portraits, scene portraits, and dialogue. For larger and more impactful scenes like cutscenes and narration, the game will switch to a more full window in the center, with usually only one large text box below describing the events. Compared to visual novels today, they're really basic, especially when it comes to interactivity. That said, if you like games that are much more heavy on story than they are on the gameplay, I recommend the localized versions of the long-running Tantei Jinguji Saburo series, known here as Jake Hunter. The two games that are localized in English that are worth playing are Jake Hunter Detective Story Memories of the Past for DS, and Jake Hunter Detective Story Ghost to the Dusk for the 3DS. The late period and the last group of 5 System Sacom games is where Manabu Saito's soundtracks fully mature. He begins to incorporate much heavier use of jazz, rock, prog, pop, and so forth. 4 of the 5 games were released between October of 1989 and October of 1990, with only his last game being released in September of 1991. With these last soundtracks, he's almost always credited with co-composers, so it does get a bit harder to tell which tracks are his. As a bit of a change of pace, I'll be playing several tracks from most of these games. It's my favorite group of soundtracks, and definitely Saito's most complex. The first game in the late period and my personal favorite soundtrack is System Sacom's 5th Novelware game titled 380,000 Kilometers of Emptiness, also known as 38 Mankilo no Koku, released in October of 1989 for the X68000, PC-98, and FM Towns. The music is also credited to Someya Kunihiro on Visual Novel Database and Moby Games, but this seems to be their only game credit. As is often the case, I wasn't able to find detailed track information, but the use of percussion is reminiscent of Evolution, so I do believe a lot of this was written by Saito. The music was released for 4 sound sources: MT32, CM64, similar to the MT32, the OPM, and OPNA. The first track I'm playing is the MT32 version of A Pack of Cigarettes. I don't have many MT32 arrangements in this episode, but it suits this track well, and is a nice contrast from all the FM music I've been playing. So here is the MT32 version of A Pack of Cigarettes from 380,000 Kilometers of Emptiness. That was the MT32 version of A Pack of Cigarettes from 380,000 Kilometers of Emptiness, composed by Manabu Saito and Sumeya Kunihiro. Following a devastating atomic war between the US and Soviet Union, the Earth has plunged into chaos and destruction in the 1990s. It isn't until the middle of the 21st century that humanity starts to recover from its losses. Earth was nearly abandoned, and representatives of the most powerful countries concentrated on space colonization projects. The Americans founded an organization called NSCA, National Space Colonized Association. Their project, Space Colony, was a huge tower, comparable to the mythical Tower of Babel. This is also home to the game's protagonist, who returns after prolonged space travel and soon becomes involved in a complex struggle between countries and political organizations. According to Egg Music, 380,000 Kilometers of Emptiness was the first MIDI-compatible game in the Japanese game market. They also complement the warm sound of the MT32 MIDI synthesizer that, quote, exquisitely supports the top-notch adult contemporary style. The second track I'm going to play is a return to some more FM music with the OPM version of Snappy Time from the X68K version of 380,000 Kilometers of Emptiness. The opening percussion section reminds me a lot of Beyond the Galaxy from Galaxy Force 2. It's a great tune, and definitely one of my top picks for the entire episode, so let's take a listen. That was the OPM version of Snappy Time from 380,000 Kilometers of Emptiness, composed by Manabu Saito and Sumeya Kunihiro. The name of the game, 380,000 Kilometers of Emptiness, most likely has to do with the distance between the Earth and the Moon. Considering the themes of isolation, separation, and so on, it really makes sense. 380,000 Kilometers of Emptiness has some of Saito's most complex music, and I think the jazzy style is really fitting for the game. I also believe that this is the soundtrack Saito himself was most proud of. An arranged version of the soundtrack was released in 1990 called A Day in the Life of 2049, and as far as I can tell, was the only official album put out by Saito during his lifetime. I absolutely love this soundtrack. It's packed with lots and lots of great music. It takes a lot of the ideas established in Chatty and carries them further in terms of sound design and composition. In internet threads and game music circles, this is probably the album that he's best known for, and rightfully so. If you listen to only one Manabu Saito soundtrack, let it be this one. The second game in Saito's late period is the sixth novelware game, The Darkness of Kin, The Predestined Homicides No. 1, released for the X68K in July of 1990. All of the various releases of The Darkness of Kin have Haruo Hosoya credited alongside Manabu Saito. I listened to Seal of the Pharaoh, which was written by Hosoya, but it's much more atmospheric and orchestral compared to the heavily melodic stuff here, so I'm not sure if he contributed as a composer or more as a sound designer for these games. I'll be playing 2 tracks from the game, starting with the X68K version of Masayuki Izawa, which is more or less the musical theme of the game. That was the OPM version of Masayuki Izawa from The Darkness of Kin, composed by Manabu Saito and Haruo Hosoya. In The Darkness of Kin, or Yami no Ketsuzoku, Miyu Izawa is a designer working for the prosperous Studio Yo in central Tokyo. She's nicknamed Famous Detective because of her unusually sharp perception. Since her childhood, she's possessed an inexplicable sixth sense that warns her of danger by coloring her vision red. When successful model and former classmate Marie is brutally murdered, Miyu decides to use her special senses to investigate the mysterious circumstances of her death. The music for The Darkness of Kin features a lot more slow ballads and Japanese-style pop tunes of the era. There's definitely some darker tunes in here, but I tried to include a mixture of styles. Like 380,000 Kilometers of Emptiness, the music for The Darkness of Kin is composed for the OPM chip and the 2 linear arithmetic MIDI synthesizers, the MT32 and CM64. The Masayuki Izawa theme is used as a main character theme, but it often gets rearranged throughout the soundtrack. I don't know that much about the game beyond its basic story and music, but it felt wrong not to include it on that fact alone. The next track is the ending theme from The Darkness of Kin for the X68000. That was the OPM version of Ending from The Darkness of Kin, composed by Manabu Saito and Haruo Hosoya. The third game in Manabu Saito's late period and his last complete original game is The Darkness of Kin, The Predestined Homicides No. 2, or The Darkness of Kin, The Final Chapter, also known as Yami no Ketsuzoku Kanketsu Hen, released for the X68000 in October of 1990. The seventh and final Novelware game, it's a direct sequel to the previous Darkness of Kin game, but is actually more of a second half of the story as opposed to a completely new game. Something I didn't mention earlier is that a lot of the music between the two Darkness of Kin games is shared, either as unused tracks or rearranged versions with slightly different percussion and sound patches. Based on the name alone, System Sacom most likely intended there to be two back-to-back games right away, so it makes sense that Saito would compose most of it at roughly the same time. Like the last game, it has music for the OPM chip, the MT32, and the CM64 sound modules. The first track I'll be playing from The Darkness of Kin, The Final Chapter, is Kumaha's Attack. It's a short but very high-energy track that sounds like it belongs more in an epic RPG than it does in a visual novel. It's one of the few Saito tracks that really goes all out, which is one of the reasons why I picked it. So here is Kumaha's Attack from the X68000 version of The Darkness of Kin, The Final Chapter. That was the OPM version of Kumaha's Attack from The Darkness of Kin, The Final Chapter, composed by Manabu Saito and Haruo Hosoya. The story of the second game follows the first. After a series of murders have occurred in Tokyo, Miyu Izawa, the heroine of the previous game and amateur detective endowed with supernatural senses, travels to Mexico with her friend. There she has to learn about the history of the country's indigenous peoples and venture into mysterious temples in order to finally discover the whole truth about recent horrifying events. Kumaha's Attack appears in both games, but I prefer the version in the second game slightly more, mostly because of the revised percussion. The second track from The Darkness of Kin, The Final Chapter, is another favorite. It reminds me a little bit of a Sonic boss theme and develops into a more melancholy dance tune. I really love when that higher melody line comes in about halfway through the B section. So here is Lean, or Lean Burned, from The Darkness of Kin, The Final Chapter, for the X68000. That was the OPM version of Lean Burned from The Darkness of Kin, the Final Chapter, composed by Manabu Saito and Haruo Hosoya. In order to finish out the discussion of the Darkness of Kin series, I need to jump ahead just a bit in the timeline past the fourth game, so bear with me. After the release of the two games, Manabu Saito's health worsens considerably, and he's hospitalized for the first time in November of 1990. On his memorial site, there are drawings of his journal entries documenting his time there, including him giving his CD of 380,000 kilometers of emptiness to the nurses, and talking briefly about his kidney surgery and recovery. From the notes, it seemed that his hospitalization lasted through December. The two Darkness of Kin games re-release as a bundle for the first time in February of 1991, as the Darkness of Kin special for the FM Towns, featuring new musical arrangements. Given the timeline in relation to his hospitalization, I'm not sure if Saito himself or Haruo Hosoya completed the arrangements, but it's mostly the same music. There was also a much later TurboGrafx CD compilation titled The Darkness of Kin, Harukaneru Memory, released in December of 1993, a year after his death. Unlike the earlier compilation, the TurboGrafx version mostly reuses older FM arrangements from the X68000 version, so there's not too much else to say about it. I wasn't originally going to play anything from the two re-releases, but here at Pixelated Audio we cherish the deep cuts, so I decided to play the intro theme used in the 1991 FM Towns re-release. This track was in the original X68000 version, but like the rest of the soundtrack, features new arrangements for the FM Towns. Here is the opening for the Darkness of Kin special for the FM Towns. That was the opening from the Darkness of Kin special for the FM Towns, composed by Manabu Saito and Haruo Hosoya. Finally, we jump all the way back to October of 1990, the same month as the second Darkness of Kin game from before. Here, we have the fourth game in the late period, Manabu Saito's arranged version of Gemini Wing for the X68000 and his last full release. It's a port of a game originally developed and published by Tecmo for arcades in 1987, with original music by Mikio Saito. Despite the names, I don't think there's a direct relationship between the two composers. This game is a bit of a special case, so I'm going to do something a little bit different here. The track I'm going to play is from Stage 6, but I'll first play a snippet from the original arcade version, followed by Manabu Saito's arrangement for the CM64 sound module. Here is Stage 6 from Gemini Wing. That was Stage 6 from Gemini Wing, composed by Mikio Saito and arranged on the CM64 by Manabu Saito. Gemini Wing is a fairly typical vertical shooter of the era, where you control a futuristic aircraft traveling over numerous terrains and shooting at enemies of an animalistic or insectoid nature. It was composed for OPM, MT32, and CM64. I initially wrote this soundtrack off since it appeared to be a fairly straightforward port, but it's notable for being one of the few games on X68000 to take advantage of the CM64's expansion cards. Similar to the MT32, the CM64 is a MIDI synthesizer, but the CM64's expansion cards were essentially sample packs. Instead of just using the default MT32 or CM64 patches, you can swap out cards for a slightly different sound source. The track I played used the Roland SN-U110-10 or Rock Drums expansion card. The fifth and final game of the group, and Manabu Saito's last, is Jerry Boy, localized as Smart Ball in the US. Originally released in September of 1991 for the Super Famicom. The game was co-developed by Game Freak, the company that eventually went on to make the Pokemon series. The main composers were Akira Yamaoka, perhaps best known for the Silent Hill series and Bimani games, Hirohiko Fukuda, who wrote music for several Bomberman games on Game Boy and Super Famicom, and finally, Manabu Saito as assistant composer. I enjoy the music to Jerry Boy and its localized Smart Ball, which features a few more tracks, but since I can't say for sure which tracks were written by Saito, I'm just taking a wild guess based on compositional style. This may not even be one of his tracks, but since I couldn't find a detailed breakdown, I'm still including my closest guess, titled Darkness from Jerry Boy on the Super Famicom. That was Darkness, composed by Akira Yamaoka, Hirohiko Fukuda, and Manabu Saito from Jerry Boy on the Super Famicom. The story of Jerry Boy is about a young prince named Jerry that's about to marry the princess Emmy, but things are about to change for the worse. Tom, Jerry's jealous brother, hires the services of a ruthless wizard and turns the poor prince into a slime. Jerry escapes but gets swept into the city's sewage system. Luckily, he's rescued by a kind old man, and Jerry embarks on a long journey to reclaim his identity and find his lovely girlfriend, Emmy. I haven't read any developer notes, but I'm gonna guess that the pun of Tom and Jerry here was intentional. Jerry Boy's an action platformer where you control a gelatinous blob. He can flatten or stretch to hit enemies, stick to walls and ceilings. He can also swallow items and use their unique properties. In between areas, Jerry visits towns and villages and has the opportunity to talk to townspeople to learn more about what lies ahead. Unfortunately, after Smart Ball, Manabu Saito was hospitalized again in July of 1992 and ultimately passed away from kidney failure in October of the same year at the age of 22. He was only active in the game industry for a short 4 years, but it's still incredible to me that he composed and arranged the music for about 15 games in that time. That's an immense amount of output, and definitely something anybody should be proud of. After learning so much about him, it makes me smile when I see his name pop up in the VGM community as a well-regarded composer every now and again. And a track from Chatty even appeared on the Digging in the Carts album released in November of 2017. That concludes the main episode content and most of the games that Manabu Saito wrote music for. But I did want to round out the episode with a brief discussion of an interesting feature of many of Saito's games. Starting with Dome, Manabu Saito would often include newer arrangements of music from previous games. It's hard to know if he was doing it just as a way to test out the capabilities of new systems and engines, or if he just enjoyed including things as Easter eggs. Either way, he enjoyed doing it, and I counted at least 7 different instances of it across his games, not including the shared tracks between the Darkness of Kin games. I'll be playing 2 pairs of examples as my final selections for the episode. The first pair come from Yuurei-kun and Valna, released in April and May of 1989. The Yuurei-kun version of this track features a slightly silly, ghostly musical tag at the end that the Valna version doesn't have. I'm guessing it didn't fit with the tone, as you'll hear. So here are the tracks Big Boss Appears from Yuurei-kun on the MSX2, followed by the unused arrangement from Valna on the PC-88. The next pair of tracks and my final selections for the episode take us all the way back to his first game, good old Euphory on the X1 from October of 1987, followed by a greatly expanded arrangement on Soft and Hard Stories from July of 1988. This same arrangement was also included on the Evolution soundtrack. Here is the track Vertes Waterway from the OPM version of Euphory for the X1, followed by the unused OPM version from Soft and Hard Stories and Evolution. Today we covered almost all of Manabu Saito's System Sacom catalog, starting from his earliest game Euphory in 1987 to his final game Jerry Boy in 1991. This episode took me a bit of time to put together for a few reasons. I wanted my information to be as accurate as possible, and I wanted to cover a lot of music over many different platforms. This was also my first time making a solo podcast, and my first time doing this much research on a video game composer only really known in Japan. I even spent a few days editing Manabu Saito's VGM Preservation Foundation entry to get all of his major game credits in one place. Gathering the research was rewarding and gave all of us at Pixelated Audio a deeper understanding and appreciation for his music. I also wanted to take this time to thank a few people. First off, Brian and James of Pixelated Audio, for giving me the opportunity to make this show, for helping me rip a lot of this music, for the moral support, helping me search for and translate pertinent information, and helping me with the feedback throughout the various drafts and revisions. I also wanted to do a few shout-outs to podcasts that I've been listening to a lot during my time working on this episode, and gave me a lot of inspiration for how to put together a solo show. First, I wanted to thank Tin Pot Gamer for introducing me to Paul McCaskey's Game Music Gaiden. I wanted to thank The Dyad for his own podcast, The Dyad Presents, and finally, a thank you to Forever Sound Version who've plugged us in the past. They're all excellent podcasts with very different takes on VGM. If you're listening to this show, there's a pretty good chance you'll enjoy them, so check them out. If you want more on the show, check us out online at pixelatedaudio.com for show notes and the track list. And don't forget to join the Pixelated Audio Discord channel. It's fairly lively in there, and you're sure to find excellent video game music, from the most obscure to well-loved classics. Feel free to leave comments and feedback on the site, or even chat with us about it on Discord. If you like the show and haven't yet, give us a review on iTunes. We'd greatly appreciate it. If you'd like to help support the show, we also have a Patreon set up, which you can find a link to on our website, pixelatedaudio.com. If you're new to our podcast, make sure to check out some of our past episodes, like episode 87, Starfire with Takashi Abo, episode 60, Herzog Zwei with Nathan and Tomomi Otani, and episode 5, an old one but a classic, Wild Arms. All fantastic episodes with some really incredible music. The track taking us out of the show is the OPM version of the Unused Song 3 from The Darkness of Kin, The Final Chapter. The track is in both Darkness of Kin games, but is listed as unused in both. It's included in every version of the game, and does end up getting used officially in the TurboGrafx CD release as the second part of the ending music. It definitely fits as an ending tune, and feels like an appropriate way to both end the episode and as a tribute to Manabu Saito. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the show.